Here's one that's been requested a few times. Smackdown 2 Know Your Role on Playstation 1. Got a story about this one too. All those years ago I had a modded PS1 that played copied games, or a chipped PlayStation as they were called around these neck of the woods. And every copy of Smackdown 2 that had been illegally burned to disc that I got my hands on didn't get past a certain bit in season mode. There must have been a huge batch of bad PAL copies because practically everyone I knew who had a modded PlayStation had the same problem that I did, though I'm sure it wasn't an issue for you pirates in the States, or maybe it was, I don't know. So I had to actually buy a full retail copy of Smackdown 2 back in the day, imagine that, and what an improvement the game was in comparison to the original Smackdown. What you may have forgot though is that Smackdown 2 was released mere months after the original. Smackdown 1 was released in March 2000 in North America and April 2000 in Europe. Smackdown 2 was released in November and December the same year. It makes you think maybe developer Yukes had a lot of ideas for the first game that didn't get implemented on time, and so those ideas were brought over to Smackdown 2, maybe. Graphically, the games do look the same, with the sequel looking a little more clean in places, but overall the graphical enhancements aren't much to talk about. And the way the game plays is more or less the same, with small tweaks being made here and there, along with certain animations getting speed alterations. On the surface, Smackdown 2 Know Your Role looks and plays pretty much the same, but once you begin digging into the game modes available along with the roster and the new match types, you'll quickly learn that it's a worthy successor even if you already own Smackdown 1. Let's get started then, and we'll take a look at Smackdown 2 Know Your Role in today's video. Smackdown 1 received good reviews and it sold pretty well too. It was by far the most feature-rich wrestling game available on PlayStation 1, and while it maybe didn't hit the same as the N64 Aki wrestling games, Smackdown was still pretty enjoyable, especially in multiplayer. After WWF Warzone and Attitude, Grapple fans were just happy to get a WWF game that played different, and this, combined with the World Wrestling Federation's success from a television standpoint during the game's release, ensured that WWF Smackdown would be a hot selling release. Yukes and publisher THQ wasted no time in getting the sequel out the door. As mentioned, Smackdown 2 looked and played a lot like its predecessor, and Yukes clearly didn't spend a whole lot of time updating the game engine either. But what fans got here was even more features and modes jam-packed onto a single disc, and for many, Smackdown 2 quickly became the essential wrestling game on Sony's PlayStation console. Many would say it wouldn't get any better on the PS1 after Smackdown 2 hit the shelves, and finally, after WrestleMania the arcade game, which I loved by the way, In Your House, Warzone, Attitude, and the first Smackdown game, the WWF finally had a PS1 game that was actually great. Not good, but great. Before we dig into these new game modes and whatnot, let me show you how to play Smackdown 1 and 2, because I don't think I went through this in the original Smackdown video. What's great about Smackdown 1 and 2 on PS1 is the fact that it's extremely accessible. In comparison to the N64 wrestling games, it's even easier to control, and while some would say it's maybe too simple and maybe too basic, the easier controls did mean that anyone could play this thing. No one would get turned off by button combinations or wondering what a certain button does in the middle of a match, because it all becomes instinctive after just one bout. The X button or the cross button performs strikes. A different direction with X gives you a different strike. The circle button with a direction will give you a grapple move. If your opponent's in a dazed state, you'll be able to perform a stronger grapple move, and if you tap circle without a direction, you'll perform an Irish whip. You can run with the triangle button, and you can follow this up with a strike or a grapple, or you can roll around, jump over, and slide under your opponent. The square button will block and perform counters. Your finishing moves are performed with the L1 button. R1 is your action button for picking up weapons, getting in and out of the ring, things like that. And honestly, that's all you need to know for Smackdown 1 and 2. Oh, down and circle pins your opponent. You'll probably need to know that too. The PS1 Smackdown games, without a doubt, are the easiest WWF games to play, and this was part of the game's appeal. Anyone could have a go at this, and you'd probably have a tougher time trying to convince your friends to have that first game, but once they did, they got hooked in just like the rest of us. The speed has been ever so slightly increased too. Matches aren't very long here, and recovery time for a down superstar is mere seconds. You're constantly fighting in Smackdown 2, and it does feel more like a fast-paced arcade game at times, and not so much a wrestling game where you put on long, epic encounters. But again, that was the appeal. WWF fans were probably getting a little fed up with pressing forward, down, up, square and X together to perform a finishing move, and they just wanted a pick up and play WWF game with no messing around. Smackdown 2 definitely definitely provided that. Let's look at the roster. I'll just go through it here and you can have a look for yourself. SmackDown 1 had 36 wrestlers to choose from, whereas SmackDown 2 has 66 wrestlers in total once everything's been unlocked. 68 if we include 2 guys who were non-selectable but still accessible through GameShark codes. We'll talk about that in a moment though. The roster here is extremely similar to WWF No Mercy, a game that was released mere days before SmackDown 2. So yeah, November 2000 was a pretty good month for WWF fans. We've got the Mean Street Posse here, the Hardy Boys, Undertaker and Kane, D-Generation X including Shawn Michaels as an unlockable character, Steve Blackman's here, which is always a good thing. We've got Too Cool, the McMahons, the Stooges, the Right to Censor, the Radicals are all accounted for, and we've got a reasonable enough women's roster too, including Ivory, Jacqueline, Lita, Trish, Chyna and others. Getting almost double the roster size would have been enough to make some fans buy SmackDown 2 without hesitation, so you can't fault the player selection. It's the most impressive WWF roster for the PlayStation 1 by far. Those 2 non-selectable wrestlers I mentioned are Ken Shamrock and The Big Show. Their models and movesets are still included on the disc, but they can only be selected after entering a GameShark code. Shamrock had left the World Wrestling Federation while SmackDown 2 was in development, so Yukes were able to take him out after the request came from WWF, but The Big Show's story's a bit more interesting. Paul White was still signed to the World Wrestling Federation, however he was sent to developmental territory OVW to get in shape and improve his in-ring abilities. Jim Ross, the head of talent relations at the time, recently said he was worried that the Athletic Commission wouldn't give Show a license to wrestle if he didn't drop some weight, and Ross was also concerned about Paul's overall health. But it sounds like the WWF weren't too concerned about the Big Show's wallet, because Paul would receive no royalties for SmackDown 2 because he was removed from the selectable roster and hidden away from plain sight. Still, with emulators and all that stuff, it's pretty easy to get access to both Shamrock and The Big Show if you really want to play as those guys. Match types then, SmackDown 2 has quite a few new additions. The Hell in a Cell makes its WWF game debut here, and yeah, it's primitive, but at least it's here. You bust through the cell using these metal panels, and when on top of the cage you can slam your opponent through the ceiling. The area you've got to do this is quite small though, so you've got to spend a little time lining your opponent up. Ladder matches are here too, and that title belt hanging from the ceiling is gonna swing around like crazy. It's your job to time your grab perfectly and leave the match holding the prize. Fans could play casket matches for the first time ever, and these are pretty hilarious to look back on. Wrestlers pick up the casket like it's absolutely nothing, and they can even throw the casket at their opponents. All you gotta do is set the casket down, whip your opponent into it, and beat your opponent up so bad that the lid closes itself. Again, it's extremely primitive, but at least it's here. I do wish though that 2K would get the finger out and add things like casket matches and buried alive matches back into the new games. Hardcore and Falls Count Anywhere matches are available, but now you can travel all around the arena while fighting your opponent. There's a ton of areas you can visit and everything's linked up, meaning you can battle in every location before bringing your opponent back to the ring, if you choose to do so. And you've also got returning match types such as cage matches, special referee matches, I Quit matches, and an assortment of multi-man matches from tags to triple threats to fatal four-ways, all of which have additional options and modifiers. Gameplay's locked at 30 frames per second, but it doesn't dip at all when more than 2 guys are in the ring. But the load times can be a bit of a hassle, especially in Royal Rumble matches. Take a look here, the next character to come into the Royal Rumble isn't preloaded in the background. It's just the way PS1 games were. Instead, the game completely stops once someone's been eliminated, and the match resumes once that character's been loaded in. This was way more tolerable back in the day, but when you play the game now, it does get a bit annoying. Along with Battle Royals, King of the Ring tournaments, and a survival mode, there's also the Slobber Knocker mode. Basically, defeat as many guys as possible within a time limit and put your name on the leaderboard. Create a Wrestler mode's back in SmackDown 2, and this was really when Create a Wrestler got good for WWF fans. Last time around you were choosing from templates really, and using parts unlocked in Season mode. There wasn't much customization available. SmackDown 2, on the other hand, gives fans a ton of options and lots of parts to edit with for the first time ever really, and players could now create wrestlers that looked at least a little similar to other superstars not featured in the game. Don't worry about this guy I created, I don't know what the fuck I was doing here. It's still nothing nothing compared to what we would get in subsequent games, but back then this was quite a lot. And Create a Wrestler also lets us see what's going on under the hood in season mode in terms of how relationships work and how likely it is that a wrestler will perform in a certain match type. You can set up relationships in Create a Wrestler mode. Who does your wrestler like and who does your wrestler dislike? You can choose match specialities that will increase the chances of a certain superstar winning simulated matchups depending on the match type. And you can also set stats and CPU logic. So there's quite a bit going on here, and for those who like to meticulously create their own customized federations with allies, foes and individual specialities, well, Smackdown 2 had you covered. Before looking at season mode though, there's a couple of other things I need to show you. Create a Taunt lets you build a taunt by selecting 2 predetermined animations. You'll see some familiar motions in here, such as Hulk Hogan's poses and Goldberg's jump after he performs a spear. Nothing too exciting, but it did give your created superstars a bit more personality, especially if you were trying to create some real life superstars from other promotions. Create a Stable lets you create tag teams and factions. You can edit their entrance music here and edit their entrance animations. Create a Pay-Per-View lets you set up your own events and you'll get scored on show quality once it's been completed. You can play matches or simulate matches, but the load times can be a killer here, especially when booking your event. It's a fantastic idea though, it's like a very early GM mode. Create a Manager is also available, and this lets you assign a manager to any superstar. Rankings lets you see who the champions are in your game and who's contending for the belts. Though I think my game's broken, The Rock's the current women's champion, and the only person in line for a title shot is also The Rock, while all the ladies, plus Vince McMahon, are contending for the light heavyweight title. It's weird. Alright, let's play season mode. In this mode, you'll go through 2 Raw shows, 2 Smackdown shows, and a pay-per-view every month, and the mode's gonna last for 2 years. You pick your superstar, I pick The Rock, you see the card for the show, and you gotta check to see if you're booked. Now, regardless if you're booked or not, you're going to have to simulate every other match and you're going to have to watch these energy bars go down until someone's named the winner. It kinda reminds me of the old Football Manager games. The same music plays for every simulated match and it gets real old real fast. So if you plan on playing this, make sure you've got your own tunes lined up, because hearing the Raw theme, the Smackdown theme, and that simulation music over and over again is going to drive you up the wall. 3 fucking weeks I sat through and I didn't get booked. I'm The Rock and Paul Bearer was getting booked in matches, what the hell? And then I remembered, The Rock's the current women's champion for whatever reason and The Rock's the only person contending for the belt. I'm not sure if those Game Shark codes to unlock Shamrock and Big Show messed up my game, so I restarted and I picked Steve Austin this time. And yeah, there we go, we've got a match. So what's good here is that you can see the logic in relationships working almost right away with the matches the game's generating. Match bookings do make sense, not including The Rock holding the women's belt, but after week 1 I was put in a feud with Vince McMahon, and by week 3 McMahon was attacking me before matches and all that stuff. You're gonna see cutscenes for other wrestlers too, guys wondering who their opponent's gonna be for the evening, or guys complaining about losing matches. That's all well and good, and in comparison to Smackdown 1 season mode, it's actually pretty awesome. This kind of thing is exactly what wrestling fans wanted in their single player experiences, but fuck does it get repetitive really fast. It's another step in the right direction. People really like to get immersed in wrestling games, particularly when it comes to overseeing the whole federation, and that's all good, but having to go through every single match to simulate the outcome, and having to watch uneventful cutscenes with loading screens in between becomes a real fucking drag in practically no time at all. Going through this just to capture this footage was bad enough, and I really couldn't imagine going through over 100 shows just to complete the game nowadays. In saying that though, it is different looking back at things like this retrospectively. Back then I loved this and it didn't bother me half as much as it does now. I even went out and bought the game after season mode crashed on a pirated copy, so I liked season mode enough that I would actually buy the game, you know. It's unfair to say it's awful nowadays, because back then it would have been the season mode that fans had longed for, but I can't imagine anyone wanting to play this now with all the other offerings we currently have, because Smackdown 2 season mode just drags on and on and on. As mentioned, there are other cutscenes in the game every now and then, including Stone Cold wrecking the DX Express for example, but that's around 30 seconds enjoyment after sinking in around 60 minutes of load screens and match simulations. The character specific cutscenes are few and far between, and it's just not worth sitting through nowadays. Quite simply, we've been spoiled by the Smackdown games that came after Smackdown 2 Know Your Role. I must reiterate though, because I'm sure many of you enjoyed this back in the day like I did, this was great over 20 years ago and we did have a lot more patience back then when it came to this kind of thing. You have to appreciate the relationships and the logic going on in the background, and it's good how match bookings are more or less on point, but if you're looking to play matches quite consistently, season mode won't be for you. You spend more time in menus than you do playing the game, and if there was just an option to simulate all matches with one button press, then it would have been a bit more tolerable in 2022. Also, I unlocked Steve Austin while playing as Steve Austin. Again, I think the Game Shark codes are causing all sorts of issues here, but regardless, you still get to see what season mode's all about here, and although I may have came off a bit harsh, it may be something that you'd still enjoy. Smackdown 2 Know Your Role shined in multiplayer modes, and even today, I think that's where the fun is. The fast-paced arcade style of matchups really are better when you're playing with friends, and you won't have to think about what you're doing too much either. You can sit and enjoy a few beers while kicking your friend's ass, because the gameplay really isn't that deep, but it's still enjoyable. This, along with the first Smackdown game, were the foundations for what was to come though, and the Yukes wrestling engine would keep getting enhanced year after year. We have now totally moved on, and 2K have developed their own wrestling engine, which really came into its own this year with 2K22, and it's going to be interesting seeing where that goes in the future. But with the old Smackdown games that we've been looking at, things would only get better when the series moved on to Sony's next console, the Playstation 2. Just bring it, shut your mouth, Here Comes the Pain and the Smackdown vs Raw series all brought something new to the table, with Here Comes the Pain in particular remaining a fan favourite, and all these games will get covered on the channel. I just have difficulties finding the time really to get reacquainted with these old classics, but I will cover the PS2 games in the future. Smackdown Shut Your Mouth was a personal favourite of mine, but I want to do the Smackdown games in order of release, so Smackdown Just Bring It will be the next WWE game covered on the channel. As for Smackdown 2 Know Your Role, I'd say it's worth playing again for a few exhibition matches. You do gain a new appreciation for how things have moved forward when you revisit the older wrestling games, and you do remember thinking back then that it could never get any better than this. So yeah, have a few games and have fun with it. The season mode though, unfortunately it wasn't as good as I remember, but that's just a personal thing. You might think differently and you might have a whole lot of fun with it. Thanks for watching this one guys, and take care.